At my husband's funeral, while his coffin was still open and the room smelled of lilies and quiet grief, my sister stood up with her 1-year-old son in her arms. She didn't cry. She didn't hesitate. She looked straight at me and said, "My son is your husband's child, and as his rightful heir, I'll be claiming half of your $900,000 house." The words hit harder than the loss itself. People gasped. Someone whispered my name. Then my sister calmly pulled out a document and added, "He updated his will. I have proof." In that moment, everyone waited for me to break. But I didn't scream. I didn't collapse. I smiled slightly and said, "Oh, I see." And I tried very hard not to laugh. Because my husband had prepared for this exact moment long before he died. My name is Harper, and until the day my husband died, I truly believed I knew everything about my life. Ethan and I had been married for 11 years. Not the kind of marriage people gushed about on social media, but the kind that actually lasted. We built routines, not fantasies. Morning coffee at the same time every day. Grocery lists stuck to the fridge. Quiet nights where silence felt safe, not awkward. Ethan was careful with everything: money, words, promises. He worked as a corporate compliance attorney, the type of man who read contracts for fun and trusted nothing that wasn't properly documented. Sometimes I teased him about it. "Relax," I'd say. "Not everything is a legal battle." He would smile and answer, "That's what people say right before things go wrong." We bought our house in Evanston, just north of Chicago, after years of saving. A 2-story home with white siding, creaky stairs, and a backyard Ethan claimed we'd use someday. The price, $900,000, terrified me. Ethan didn't blink. "We'll be fine," he said. "I've planned for worse." What we never planned for was losing the chance to have children. After years of appointments and quiet disappointment, we stopped trying. One night, lying in bed with the lights off, Ethan squeezed my hand. "It doesn't make us less of a family," he said softly. I believed him. I still do. My sister, Lydia, however, saw our life very differently. To her, we were lucky. Too lucky. Lydia had always lived in extremes, big dreams, bigger excuses. She jumped from job to job, relationship to relationship, always convinced that stability was something other people were handed, not earned. Our parents worried about her constantly and mistook guilt for support. When Lydia got pregnant unexpectedly, she showed up at my door in tears. "I don't know how to do this alone," she said, so I helped. I drove her to doctor's appointments. I watched her son, Noah, when she needed rest. I paid for things she promised she'd pay back someday. Family helps family, that's what I told myself. Ethan was polite to Lydia, distant but never unkind. He rarely stayed in the same room as her for long. At the time, I thought it was because being around a baby reminded him of what we couldn't have. Now, I understand it differently. Looking back, there were moments that didn't fit, but grief has a way of rewriting memory. Ethan insisted on updating our wills more often than necessary. He asked strange questions about inheritance laws. He once said, half joking, "If anyone ever claims something absurd, promise me you won't panic." I laughed it off. "I trust you," I told him. He looked at me for a long moment and replied, "That's exactly why I did everything properly." I didn't know then what he meant. I didn't know that while I was focused on holding our family together, someone else was quietly planning to tear it apart. And I certainly didn't know that my sister would choose his funeral the one day meant for grief to make her move. When I look back now, what scares me most isn't what my sister did at my husband's funeral. It's how long she had been preparing for it right in front of me. After Noah was born, Lydia became a constant presence in my house. At first, it made sense. She was a single mother, exhausted, overwhelmed, and desperate for help. I told myself that family showed up when things got hard, so I let her in. She started coming over without warning. Sometimes early in the morning, sometimes late at night, when Ethan and I were finally alone. She always brought Noah, always settling herself in the living room, always positioning the baby so Ethan would notice. "Doesn't he have your eyes?" she said once, laughing lightly as she rocked Noah in her arms. Ethan paused, uncomfortable. "I don't see it," he replied. I felt my face burn. "Lydia, don't be weird," I said quickly. She smiled, unapologetic. "I'm just saying, babies pick up traits from people around them. Ethan stood up and excused himself to the kitchen. At the time, I thought he was avoiding a painful reminder of what we couldn't have. Now I know he was avoiding her. There were moments, small ones, that didn't sit right. Once, I walked into the kitchen and found Lydia standing far too close to Ethan, her voice low, her tone playful in a way that didn't belong. "You don't have to act like I'm invisible," she said. Ethan stepped back immediately when he saw me. "Harper," he said evenly, "your sister was just leaving." Lydia laughed, but her eyes didn't. "You're always so serious," she told him. "Relax. I'm family." Ethan met her gaze, calm but firm. "Exactly. Which is why boundaries matter." I tried to smooth things over. I always did. "She's just lonely," I told him later. "This is hard for her." Ethan didn't argue. He rarely did. But that night he said something that stuck with me. Loneliness doesn't excuse entitlement. Over time, Lydia's behavior shifted. The tears became complaints. The gratitude faded into expectation. She talked endlessly about how unfair life was, how difficult everything had become since Noah's father disappeared. "You have no idea how lucky you are," she said one afternoon, looking around my living room. "The house, the stability, a husband who actually sticks around." I answered carefully. "We worked for this." She scoffed. "Easy to say when things work out for you." That word "deserved" started coming up more often. "He deserves more than this," she said once, rocking Noah to sleep on my couch. "He deserves security." I nodded, thinking she meant help. I was wrong. Ethan became quieter around her, more watchful. He stopped being alone in the room with Lydia altogether. When she spoke, he listened not casually, but carefully, as if weighing every word. One night at dinner, seemingly out of nowhere, Ethan said, "I want to update our wills again." I blinked. "We just updated them last year." "I know," he replied calmly, "but circumstances change." Something in his tone made me uneasy. "Is something wrong?" I asked. "No," he said, then added, "Not yet." I didn't push. I trusted him more than anyone. What I didn't realize was that Ethan had started documenting everything: dates, comments, moments that felt off. He asked subtle questions about inheritance laws, about false claims, about how courts handle disputes involving children. I teased him once. "Are you expecting someone to sue us?" He smiled faintly. "I expect people to do desperate things when they think they're owed something." Meanwhile, Lydia watched us. Not with affection, not with jealousy, with calculation. She once held Noah up toward Ethan and said softly, almost experimentally, "He could grow up here, you know." Ethan didn't respond. He simply looked at me and said, "Harper, can I talk to you for a moment?" In private, he squeezed my hand. "Promise me something," he said. "If anyone ever makes a claim that sounds outrageous, don't panic." I laughed, brushing it off. "Why would anyone do that?" He didn't answer. If I had understood then what he was preparing for, maybe I would have seen my sister more clearly. But love has a way of blinding us, especially when the threat wears a familiar face. And Lydia was already counting what she believed would soon be hers. Ethan died on a Tuesday morning. Not suddenly, not violently, just quietly, the way he did most things in life. A cerebral aneurysm, the doctors said. No warning signs anyone could have caught in time. One moment he was pouring coffee, the next he was gone. I remember the sound of the mug hitting the floor. I remember kneeling beside him, calling his name, telling him to wake up, as if stubbornness alone could bring him back. I remember the paramedics speaking gently, already knowing what I hadn't accepted yet. By noon, my world had narrowed to paperwork, phone calls, and a silence that felt too large for the house. Lydia arrived before I even called her. She swept in with Noah bundled against her chest, eyes wide, voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "Oh, Harper," she whispered, hugging me tightly. "This is awful, just awful." I noticed distantly that she didn't ask how he died. The days that followed blurred together. Condolences, meals dropped off by neighbors, cards filled with careful handwriting and phrases like, "He was such a good man, and let us know if you need anything." Lydia stayed close. Too close. She offered to help with arrangements, insisted on being involved in every detail. "You shouldn't have to handle this alone," she said. "I'm family." At first, I was grateful. Grief makes you reach for anything solid. But there were moments again, small ones, that unsettled me. She asked questions that felt oddly specific. Did Ethan leave everything to you? Did he ever mention changing the will? Where do you keep important documents? I assumed she was trying to help. I assumed wrong. The night before the funeral, I couldn't sleep. The house felt hollow without Ethan's steady presence. I wandered into his home office, the room he kept meticulously organized, every file labeled, every drawer intentional. His desk was exactly as he'd left it. Except for one thing. A manila folder sat on top, placed too deliberately to be accidental. Inside were copies of documents, legal, medical, personal, neatly arranged. On top was a note in his handwriting. Harper, if you're reading this, something has happened. Please trust me. My hands shook as I read the rest. He didn't explain everything. Not yet. But he reminded me of something crucial. People reveal their intentions under pressure. Let them. I closed the folder and pressed it to my chest, grief and confusion colliding in my throat. The next day was the funeral. The chapel was filled with people Ethan had helped over the years, colleagues, clients, friends who respected him deeply. They spoke of his integrity, his foresight, his fairness. Lydia sat in the front row with Noah, dressed in black, her expression solemn. She dabbed at her eyes, though I never saw tears fall. When the service ended, people lined up to offer condolences. I thanked them numbly, my body moving on autopilot. Then Lydia stood. She didn't wait for a pause. She didn't ask for privacy. She turned toward the room and said, "There's something everyone deserves to know." My heart dropped. She took a step forward, holding Noah higher as if presenting evidence. "My son is Ethan's child," she said. "And as his rightful heir, I'll be claiming half of Harper's house." They've we K in the mall ball, the teen J. The room froze. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered my name. Lydia continued, her voice steady. "Ethan updated his will. I have proof." She pulled out the document and held it up. All eyes turned to me. I felt the weight of every stare, every assumption forming in real time, the betrayal they imagined, the scandal they consumed silently. I should have broken. Instead, I felt something else rise cold, clear, unmistakable. "Recognition," I said quietly. "Oh, I see." And I tried not to laugh. Because in that moment, standing beside my husband's casket, I finally understood why Ethan had been so careful, why he'd watched Lydia so closely, why he'd prepared me for outrageous claims. This wasn't grief speaking. This was a plan, and Lydia had just made the mistake of playing her hand too early. As people murmured around us, I met her eyes. For the first time, her confidence wavered. She had expected tears, panic, confusion. She hadn't expected silence. And she definitely hadn't expected me to already know that everything she held in her hands was about to collapse. The chapel didn't erupt into chaos the way movies portray moments like that. It was worse. People whispered. Heads leaned together. Eyes moved back and forth between my sister and me, searching for reactions, choosing sides in silence. Grief had turned into curiosity, and curiosity into judgment, all within seconds. Lydia stood there, calm, almost composed, rocking Noah gently as if she were doing nothing more than comforting a tired child. "This isn't about drama," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It's about what's right." I felt the pressure in my chest tighten not from fear, but from restraint. "This is neither the time nor the place," I said quietly. "If you have a legal matter, it can be addressed privately." She tilted her head, a faint smile touching her lips. "I tried to do this privately," she replied. "But you wouldn't understand. You're too emotional right now." A murmur passed through the room. Emotional. Grieving. Unstable. I saw it clearly, then what she was doing. I took a slow breath. "Ethan would have wanted dignity," I said. "For everyone." Lydia shrugged. "Ethan would have wanted his child protected." She held up the document again. "This will proves it." I didn't reach for it this time. Instead, I looked at her and asked, "Who prepared that document?" Her eyes flickered. "Just for a second." "A lawyer," she said quickly. "Which one?" I asked. She hesitated. "I don't see why that matters." "It matters," I said evenly, "because Ethan worked with the same firm for over a decade. He never made changes without filing them properly." Silence spread, heavier now. Lydia's voice sharpened. "Are you accusing me of lying?" I'm saying this conversation doesn't belong here, I replied. And neither does that claim. Someone from Ethan's office, Mark Reynolds, his attorney, stepped forward. Harper, he said gently. If you'd like, we can discuss this later. Lydia's gaze snapped to him. You knew, she said. You all knew. No, Mark replied calmly. But I know how Ethan handled his affairs. That was when Lydia lost her composure. You think you're better than me? She snapped, her voice rising. You think because you have a house and a husband had a husband that you deserve everything? A collective intake of breath filled the chapel. I felt something inside me settle. This isn't about deserving, I said. It's about facts. She laughed bitterly. Facts? Fine. Let's talk facts. Ethan and I had a relationship. He didn't want anyone to know. I felt the sting of that lie not because it hurt, but because it was meant to. Lydia, I said softly, stop. No, she replied. You don't get to silence me anymore. I stepped closer, not aggressively, but deliberately. If you continue, I said, you'll be making statements that carry legal consequences. That caught her attention. You wouldn't, she said. I would, I answered. And so would Ethan's attorney. The room had gone completely quiet now. Lydia clutched Noah tighter, her voice wavering for the first time. So, you're just going to deny my son? She demanded. In front of everyone? I shook my head. I'm going to protect the truth, I said. And I'm going to protect Ethan's name. Mark placed a hand lightly on my arm. Harper, let's step outside. I nodded. As I walked past Lydia, she leaned in and whispered, You can't stop this. I met her eyes. Watch me. Outside, the cold air hit my face, sharp and grounding. My hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from adrenaline. I didn't plan to do this today, I said to Mark. But I know that Will isn't real. He studied me carefully. Are you certain? Yes, I said. And I can prove it. Inside the chapel, Lydia was already surrounded, some people comforting her, others questioning her quietly. She played the part perfectly. The wronged mother, the silenced truth-teller. But something had shifted. People weren't just looking at me anymore. They were watching her. And for the first time since Ethan died, I felt something other than grief take root in my chest. Control. Because Lydia thought the funeral was her moment, she didn't realize it was the moment she exposed herself. And she had no idea how prepared Ethan and I were to respond. The house felt different after the funeral. Not empty, exposed. Every sound echoed too loudly. Every corner reminded me that Ethan had planned for things I never wanted to imagine. I locked the door, drew the curtains, and finally allowed myself to open the folder he had left behind. Inside was order. Not emotion, not explanation, just facts. Ethan had labeled everything in his precise handwriting. Dates, times, references. Each document stacked exactly where it belonged, as if he'd known panic would make clarity essential. The first page was his official will, not a copy, not a draft. The original, notarized and filed, naming me as the sole beneficiary of the house, our savings, and every shared asset. Below it was a handwritten note. This is the only version that matters. My hands trembled as I turned the page. Next came his medical records. 3 years earlier, long before Noah was born, Ethan had undergone a vasectomy. The procedure, the follow-up tests, the confirmation of success. Everything documented, signed, verified. I sat back in my chair, breath catching in my throat. This wasn't a defense. This was a wall. Then I found the journal. Ethan had never been one to write about feelings, but these entries were different. They were observations measured, cautious, unmistakably concerned. Lydia has crossed boundaries again today. I told her clearly that her behavior is inappropriate. She laughed it off. I documented it anyway. Page after page, he recorded interactions I had brushed aside. Comments she made. Moments she lingered. The way she framed jokes that weren't jokes at all. If this escalates, he wrote, Harper must not be blindsided. I pressed my hand over my mouth. The final item in the folder was a sealed envelope addressed to me. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single letter. Harper, if you're reading this, then I wasn't there to stop something I knew might come. I hope I was wrong. But hope is not a strategy. You are stronger than you think. Trust the evidence. Trust yourself. And do not let guilt silence you. I cried, then not loudly, not dramatically. just quietly the way Ethan would have understood. The next morning, Lydia's lawyer called. She had moved fast. Her claim was simple: paternity, inheritance, rightful share. She demanded mediation, hinted at public action if I resisted. Mark Reynolds listened patiently as I relayed everything. When I finished, he said calmly, "Harper, this case doesn't exist." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean legally," he continued. "She has no standing, no verified will, no biological claim. And what she did at the funeral publicly accusing puts her at risk." Achy. I felt a mix of relief and anger. "She used Noah," I said. "She used grief." "Yes," Mark replied, "and that matters." We decided not to respond immediately. Instead, we gathered medical experts, legal confirmations, certified copies of everything Ethan had prepared. We requested Lydia's document for forensic review. The result wasn't surprising. The will she presented was a forgery. Wrong paper, wrong formatting, no filing record. The signature was a crude imitation close enough to fool people who wanted to believe it, but nowhere near good enough to survive scrutiny. Still, Lydia pushed. She sent messages accusing me of cruelty, of denying a child his father, of hiding behind lawyers. "You know what you're doing," she wrote. "Everyone will see it." I didn't reply, because while Lydia relied on pressure, Ethan had relied on proof. Mark arranged a private meeting. When Lydia walked into the conference room, she looked tired but defiant. Noah wasn't with her this time. Without him, her confidence felt thinner. "This could have been handled quietly," she said. "You didn't have to humiliate me." "You humiliated yourself," Mark replied calmly. I slid the documents across the table. The will, the medical records, the journal. Lydia's face drained of color. "That's not possible," she whispered. "It is," I said evenly, "and it always was." She looked at me then, not as a sister, not even as an enemy, but as someone who realized her plan had failed completely. "You planned this?" she said weakly. "No," I replied. "Ethan did." Silence filled the room. "You can walk away now," Mark said. "Retract your claim, publicly, or this becomes something much worse." Lydia's hands shook. For the first time, she wasn't calculating. She was afraid. And I knew then that the story wasn't over, not yet. Because desperation doesn't disappear when it's cornered. It mutates. And Lydia was about to reveal just how far she was willing to go. After that meeting, Lydia disappeared. No calls, no messages, no public statements. For 3 days, the silence felt heavier than the accusations had been. Mark warned me not to mistake it for surrender. "People don't retreat when they're cornered," he said. "They regroup." So we kept digging. Not because we needed more proof, but because I needed to understand why. Why my sister had been willing to destroy Ethan's name, weaponize her own child, and shatter whatever trust remained between us. The answers came faster than I expected. Lydia was drowning. Financial records revealed unpaid loans, maxed-out credit cards, and an eviction notice she'd managed to delay but not erase. She owed nearly $75,000 medical bills, short-term loans, interest stacked on interest. The father of Noah was gone. Not deceased, not heroic, just gone. He'd left shortly after the pregnancy, changed numbers, and disappeared from every traceable record. Lydia had told everyone he was out of the picture by choice. That part was true. What wasn't true was how long she'd been planning her replacement. "She didn't just snap," Mark said quietly. "This was calculated." End quote. We learned that Lydia had consulted online forums about inheritance disputes, that she'd searched repeatedly for challenging a will, claiming paternity after death and property rights for illegitimate children. She hadn't acted out of grief. She had acted out of fear. Still, knowing the reason didn't soften the damage. Mark recommended a private confrontation, controlled, documented, and legally supervised. I agreed. When Lydia walked into the office this time, she looked smaller. Her shoulders were tense, her confidence stripped down to raw defensiveness. "I already said I'd drop it," she snapped. "What more do you want?" "The truth," I said. She laughed bitterly. "You already have your win." "This isn't about winning," I replied. "It's about accountability." Mark placed a recorder on the table. "With your consent," he said, "this conversation will be documented." Lydia hesitated, then nodded. "Start talking," she muttered. I took a breath. When did you decide Ethan would be your solution? Her head jerked up. That's not fair. It's accurate, I said. So, answer the question. She stared at the table. After Noah was born, she admitted. When I realized how alone I was. And the will? Mark asked. She swallowed. I had someone help me draft it. I thought if it looked real enough. You knew it was fraudulent, Mark said calmly. Yes, she snapped. I knew. The room went quiet. I leaned forward. You stood at my husband's funeral, I said, my voice steady but tight, and accused him of betraying me. You watched people look at me like I was a fool. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time, they didn't move me. I didn't think you'd fight back, she whispered. You're always so forgiving. That hurt more than the accusation. You used that, I said. She nodded. I thought you'd panic, that you'd settle just to make it go away. And Noah? I asked softly. Did you ever think about what this would do to him? She looked away. I needed him to be my leverage, she said. There it was. Not malice. Not hatred. Desperation. Stripped bare and ugly. Mark cleared his throat. Legally, he said, we can pursue this further. Fraud, defamation, false claims. The evidence supports it. Lydia's breath hitched. Please, she said quietly. I can't survive that. I studied her, really studied her. This wasn't the sister I'd protected for years. This was someone who had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. But Noah hadn't. I closed my eyes briefly, then made my decision. There will be consequences, I said. Just not the ones you're expecting. She looked up, confused. You will publicly retract your claim, I continued. In writing, legally binding, you will acknowledge that Ethan was not Noah's father, and that the will you presented was invalid. She nodded quickly. And, I added, you will never again reference Ethan's name in connection with your child. Her shoulders slumped. What happens to me? She asked. That depends on what you do next, I said. I slid a document across the table. A trust, I explained. For Noah. Education, healthcare, managed by a third party. You won't control it. Lydia stared at it, stunned. You'd do that, she whispered. After everything? I'm not doing it for you, I replied. I'm doing it because someone has to stop this from poisoning another life. She broke, then not theatrically, not manipulatively, just quietly. I didn't want to be like this, she said. I just didn't know how else to survive. I stood. Survival doesn't excuse harm, I said, but it does give you a chance to change. As we left the room, Mark spoke softly. You handled that with restraint. I shook my head. I handled it with boundaries, I said. There's a difference. Because forgiveness without accountability isn't kindness. It's permission. And I was done giving Lydia permission to hurt me. The family meeting happened on a Sunday afternoon. My parents' house looked exactly the same as it always had: neutral colors, carefully arranged furniture, the kind of space where difficult conversations had been postponed for decades under the excuse of keeping the peace. Lydia arrived late. She didn't bring Noah. That alone told me everything. We sat in the living room, the air thick with expectation. My mother clutched a mug she never drank from. My father stood near the window, arms crossed, already bracing for impact. I'm here because I was told this couldn't wait, my father said. So let's stop circling. Lydia swallowed hard. There's something I need to say, she began. And it's not going to sound good. My mother's face tightened. What have you done? Lydia's eyes flicked to me, then back to them. I lied, she said. At Ethan's funeral. About everything. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. What do you mean, lied? My mother demanded. The will was fake, Lydia said quietly. And Ethan was never Noah's father. My father exhaled slowly, like the floor had dropped out beneath him. You accused him publicly, he said. At his funeral. I know, Lydia whispered. My mother turned to me then, confusion and shame fighting for space in her expression. Harper, she said, why didn't you tell us sooner? Because I wanted Lydia to tell you herself, I replied. And because the truth doesn't need to shout. Lydia nodded, tears sliding down her face. I was desperate, she said. I thought if I acted first, if I sounded certain, no one would question me. My father's voice hardened. You used your child, he said. You used grief. I know, she sobbed. And I'm so sorry. My mother looked at her, stunned. We defended you, she said. We questioned Harper instead. That hurt, but it also clarified something I'd known for a long time. Favoritism doesn't disappear when it's exposed. It just changes form. There are consequences, I said calmly. Legal ones. Personal ones. Lydia looked at me, panic flickering. I've signed the retraction, she said quickly. I'll say it publicly. I swear. You will, I agreed. And you'll respect every boundary going forward. My father nodded slowly. That's not optional, he said. It's the minimum. My mother wiped her eyes. What happens now? She asked. That depends, I said. On whether we stop pretending love means protection without accountability. The room went quiet. For the first time, no one rushed to soften Lydia's discomfort. She stood, shoulders shaking. I don't expect forgiveness, she said. But I'm asking for the chance to do better. I met her gaze. You'll get the chance, I said. But not access, not control, and not at my expense. That distinction mattered. After the meeting, my parents walked me to the door. I'm sorry, my mother said quietly. We should have seen this. Yes, I replied. You should have. Outside, the air felt lighter. Not because everything was fixed, but because nothing was hidden anymore. Later that evening, my phone buzzed. A message from Lydia. I've posted the statement. I didn't mention Ethan again. I didn't reply. Because closure doesn't always require conversation. Sometimes it requires distance. And as I stood alone in the house Ethan and I had built together, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not anger, not grief, clarity. I had lost my husband, but I had not lost myself. And for the first time since his death, I knew exactly what the next chapter would not include. A year after Ethan's funeral, I stood alone in the kitchen and realized something unexpected. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. For a long time, I had mistaken silence for loneliness. I thought peace would only return if everything went back to the way it was before the betrayal, before the accusations, before grief turned my own family into strangers. But healing didn't look like restoration. It looked like clarity. The legal process ended quietly. Lydia followed through on her public statement, formally retracting every claim she had made. The forged will disappeared as quickly as it had surfaced, replaced by court-verified documents that left no room for doubt. No hearings, no trials, just the slow, steady dismantling of a lie that had never been strong enough to survive the truth. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel victorious. I felt relieved. Because justice doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it arrives as silence when the noise finally stops. Lydia and I no longer speak the way sisters are expected to. We exchange brief messages about Noah. Logistics. Appointments. Necessary things. There is politeness but no intimacy, and that's okay. I used to believe forgiveness meant reopening doors. Now I understand it can simply mean not carrying the weight anymore. My parents struggled with this new reality. My mother, especially, grieved the version of family she had always insisted we were. There were tense conversations, long pauses, a few tears that came too late to undo the damage but early enough to prevent more. One evening, she said quietly, I didn't protect you when I should have. I nodded. No, but you're learning now. That was the most honest exchange we'd had in years. As for me, I rebuilt my life slowly and intentionally. I stayed in the house, not because of pride, not because I wanted to prove anything, but because Ethan and I had chosen it together. I turned his old office into a quiet reading room. I planted new flowers in the garden where he once spent hours planning a future we never got to live. I allowed the memories to exist without letting them define me. Grief didn't disappear. It softened. It became something I carried instead of something that carried me. What surprised me most was how often people reached out after hearing what had happened. Friends, acquaintances, even strangers. They told me their own stories about family members who crossed lines, about inheritances used as weapons, about silence that protected abusers instead of victims, and almost all of them said the same thing. I wish I had set boundaries sooner. That's the lesson Ethan tried to teach me long before his death. Love without boundaries isn't love. It's vulnerability without protection. Documentation isn't distrust. It's self-respect. And family doesn't get a free pass to harm you just because you share blood. I used to think strength meant enduring quietly. Now I know it means speaking clearly, choosing peace over approval, truth over comfort, and yourself over the version of you others find easiest to manipulate. Sometimes the people who accuse you the loudest are counting on your silence. Don't give it to them. If there's one thing I want anyone listening to take from my story, it's this. Protect your future while things are calm. Ask questions when something feels wrong. And never mistake cruelty wrapped in familiarity for love. Because when everything else is stripped away, titles, roles, expectations, what remains is this. You are allowed to be safe. You are allowed to say no. And you are allowed to rebuild a life that doesn't include those who tried to take advantage of your pain. Ethan once told me, preparation isn't pessimism, it's love with foresight. He was right. And in the end, his love didn't just protect me from lies. It taught me how to stand on my own, without fear, without apology, and without laughter held back.